Well, welcome back to the campfire. We got more stories to tell and camaraderie to share. And tonight I'm going to read you a little more of this fine story, The Coyote by James Roberts. We worked our way up to chapter 9. And if you want to catch up and read 1 through 8, why, you can find it right here. Tonight, we're going to start with Leave It to Me. Get yourself settled in. Here we go. Now Rathburn had recognized the ranch long before they came close to it. It was the place where he had stopped for a meal with the girl and the freckle-faced boy 2 days before, the day he had gone on into Dry Lake. Now he saw no sign of that girl or the boy or anyone else as they reached the front door and hurried inside. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Lamy look hurriedly about and step into the kitchen. He followed him. Lamy grabbed a part of a loaf of bread and some cold meat on a shelf above the kitchen table. Well, there's usually a cellar under the main room in these square houses, he said, hurrying back into the larger room. Rathburn stepped after him, and Lamy pulled back the rug before the table, disclosing a trapdoor. He raised the door, held out the food to Rathburn, and whispered, "You better get down there. Take this grub and—" "What's the matter? Isn't there room for both of us?" Rathburn put the question in a voice which conveyed surprise. "Well, I thought it might be better if we didn't both hide in the same place," whispered Lamy. "Then they'd only get one of us, and whichever it was, they'd think he was the one they wanted, see?" He appeared real excited. Rathburn's eyes narrowed. His right hand darted to his gun in a flash, and the muzzle of the weapon was pressed into Lamy's ribs. "Get down there," commanded Rathburn. "Get down." Lamy hesitated with a wild look in his eyes. The muzzle of Rathburn's gun pressed harder against his midriff. He dropped lightly into the cellar. Rathburn pulled the rug against the trapdoor as he followed, then let down the door, certain that the rug would fall into place. The pair sat upon some gunny sacks in the little cellar until their eyes became accustomed to the darkness. They could dimly see each other by the faint light which came to them through some cracks in the floor above. They heard steps at the rear of the house, then the pound of hooves from in front. Rathburn saw Lamy staring at him fixedly with a puzzled look. He frowned at him. Rathburn still held his gun in his hand. Both had forgotten the food which Lamy had in his lap. "Say," whispered Lamy, "what was your idea in giving me back my gun?" He moved closer to get the reply. "Shut up," said Rathburn, cocking an ear towards the trapdoor. The sound of footsteps now was in the kitchen. They heard horses snorting and men dismounting at the front door. And after a brief space there was light footsteps in the room above, followed by the tramp of heavy boots. "Good morning, ma'am," came a deep voice. "Good morning," was the hesitating reply. Rathburn recognized the voice of the girl who had fed him. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Neal of San Jacinto County," continued the deep voice as several feet shuffled lightly. "Now these men with me are members of my posse. Maybe you know Judge Brown?" I've seen him," answered the girl. Now Rathburn could feel Lamy's knees shaking against him in excitement. "I believe we met one time," Brown put in. Rathburn thought the justice's voice sounded tired. "Ma'am, we're looking for a man, or 2 men. It was the sheriff speaking again. "Have you seen anyone around here this morning? Any stranger, or any strangers, I mean?" "Why, no," replied the girl with a breathless catch in her voice. "Haven't seen anyone." "Now you're sure?" Rathburn frowned at the sheriff's tone, although he kept his eye on Lamy's white face. He smiled as he remembered that the sheriff had mentioned 2 men. This doubtless was the cause of Lamy's agitation. Nor did he think Lamy had forgotten that he, Rathburn, had pointed out that he could prove he didn't rob the place in Dry Lake. "Now you're really sure?" the sheriff asked again. "Why, yes," replied the girl. "I am sure." "Maybe she can get us some breakfast," said Brown hopefully. "Can you feed 5 men, ma'am?" asked the sheriff in a softer tone. "Well, just sit down and I'll get you some breakfast," said the girl. The 2 men in the little cellar could hear some of the men taking chairs and 1 or 2 going back out to look after the horses. The girl's light footsteps retreated into the kitchen. Rathburn smiled mysteriously at Lamy, who was shivering with a case of nerves. "I can't understand who that was with him, or following him," came Brown's voice. "Somebody must have seen him getting away and set out on the trail while it was hot." "Either that or saw him beating it somewheres on the trail east of town and took after him on suspicion," drawled the sheriff. "'Spect everybody round here seen them reward notices you put out." "That's so," said Brown. "I had the right hunch when I got the tip he'd left his Arizona hangout, Sheriff. I figured he'd head this way. When he had the nerve. Well, you know what happened in my office." The sheriff chuckled. Then he spoke angrily. "He can't pull any of his stunts in my territory," he said growlingly. "I'll hunt him down if I have to put every man I've got on the trail and keep him there. I figure, though," he added hopefully, "that we've got him cornered in or around this valley. We traced him here, and we got sight of him yesterday. We'll have him 'fore nighttime." "I hope so," said Brown grimly. "I've given orders to shoot and kill and not to miss," thundered the sheriff, "but I guess the rewards offered for him would kind of steady the aim of the man that got a crack at him." Rathburn's face went white, and his eyes shot fire as he listened to the sheriff's cruel laugh, in which the others in the room above now joined in. Lamy signaled that he wished to whisper in his ear, and Rathburn bent his head, although he kept the gun handy. "I'm not going to risk shooting anybody if we should be found or cornered," Lamy whispered. "I thought you ought to know." "If we're cornered, you leave it to me," Rathburn came back. "I have reasons for everything I'm a-doing. And don't forget that I'd rather be grabbed for this simple trick of yours in Dry Lake than for 1 or 2 jobs over in Arizona. If things go wrong, you keep your mouth shut. Don't you talk. If you start talking any time, I'll try to kill you." Lamy drew back from the ferocity in Rathburn's tone and manner. That menacing message was again in Rathburn's eyes. "Who's that boy out there?" the sheriff called sharply. "Go in and say, 'How do you do?'" came the girl's voice from the kitchen. "It's my brother, Frankie." "Come here, Frankie," said the sheriff. The pair below heard light footsteps on the floor above. "That's a fine crop of freckles you've got," said the sheriff. Rathburn saw Lamy put a hand to his face and make a grimace. "Listen, Frankie, did you see anybody around here this morning?" asked the sheriff. "Who you looking for?" asked the boy. Rathburn started. His body suddenly tensed. "I'm looking for an outlaw they call the Coyote," returned the sheriff. "Ever hear of him?" Yes. Ed brought home a notice about a reward for him." "Well, that's the man we're after. Rides a dun-colored horse, tall, light complexioned. See anybody like that around here?" "Well, he was here day before yesterday," said the boy truthfully. "Sis gave him something to eat, and he went on into town. He didn't seem like such a bad man to me. Told me never to lie." He was here? Ate here?" Sheriff's voice was excited. Rathburn saw Lamy's eyes widen. "Frankie," the sheriff said soberly, "that cowboy went into town and robbed a place. He's a bad, dangerous man no matter how he looks or what he says. Have you seen anybody that looked like him since?" The question was followed by a deep silence. Rathburn, alert, his eyes gleaming, heard the sheriff rise. "Answer me, boy. I'm the sheriff of this here county." "'Tain't that," said the boy in a tremulous voice. "Only I'd rather not tell, Mr. Sheriff." "You must answer me," said the official sternly. "Have you seen anyone around here yesterday or this morning?" Yes." "When?" demanded the sheriff, "and don't lie." This morning," stammered the boy. "Where? Tell me about it, quick." 2 men ran across from the timber to the house, replied the boy. He said not to lie for him, but the sheriff stepped quickly to the kitchen door. I thought you said no one had been around here, ma'am. Why, I didn't see anyone, came the girl's voice. I saw 'em from the pasture, the boy confessed. Then they're here, cried the sheriff. Search the house and the barn. In the dim, narrow cellar, Rathburn was holding his gun aimed at Lamy's heart. You remember what I said about keeping your mouth shut? He asked in a low voice, his steel blue gaze boring into the other's eyes. Lamy gasped. Then he slowly nodded his head. Well, that's your bond, said Rathburn, as trampling feet sounded overhead. Chapter 10, Caught in the Cellar. Rathburn rose and crouched under the trapdoor, gun in hand. Lamy watched him, breathless, perplexed, uncertain. They heard men running, then there was no sounds from above, and a deathly stillness settled down. Slowly, and with infinite care, Rathburn raised the trapdoor an inch or two and listened intently. Lamy scrambled to his knees on that pile of gunny sacks, but Rathburn swung quickly upon him. They stared at each other in the semi-darkness. He said 2, breathed Lamy, a curious look in his eyes. Are you afraid? Mocked Rathburn. It's me they want. Don't you worry, I may make a break for it, and if I do, there's likely to be powder burned. You can stay here and get out when they take after me if I go, said Rathburn. And the sneer in his voice caused Lamy to flush uncomfortably. Rathburn petted the gun in his hand. But before I make a break, I want to tell you something that I should have told you before this, when I had more time. He bit off his speech as there was a sudden recurrence of the sounds in the house. The trapdoor closed down. Where's the cellar? Came the sheriff's authoritative voice. Many feet tramped upon the floor above him. Then they heard the rug stripped back. There was an exclamation from the sheriff, and the sound of moving feet suddenly was stilled. Is there anyone in that cellar? The sheriff called. Silence, with Lamy pressing Rathburn's knee with one hand, and Rathburn smiling that queer, grim smile which conveyed so much, yet nothing which was tangible. Get around here, you fellers, they heard the sheriff order. The sound of boots and spurs attested to the quickness with which his order was obeyed. Rathburn leaned down suddenly and with lightning swiftness jerked Lamy's gun from its holster near his side. He tossed the weapon to the corner of the dark cellar just as the sheriff's voice was heard again. Coyote, if you're down there, I'm not going to take a chance fumbling with that door. If you ain't there, then there won't be any harm in what I'm going to do. If I don't hear nothing when I finish talking, I'm going to give the signal to my men to start shooting through the floor. And I mean it. If anybody's down there, it'd be good sense to flip up that door and crawl out hands first, and them hands is empty. Sheriff, you're bluffing, said Rathburn loudly. Then the sheriff spoke again in an exultant tone. I figure it was the best hiding place you could find, Coyote. You're right. I was sort of bluffing, but I might have changed my mind and gone on through with it. We got you dead to rights, Coyote. You haven't got a chance. There's 7 of us now, and every man is ready to open up if you come out of there shooting. Rathburn slipped his gun back into his holster. He raised that trapdoor slowly until it tipped back on the floor, leaving the opening into the cellar clear. 2 of 'em, he heard someone exclaim. He looked up to accustom his eyes to the light and saw a dozen guns covering him. Gentlemen, the landscape fairly bristles with artillery, he said amiably. Who's the sheriff? And, well, there's Judd Brown. Who let you loose, Judd? I'm Sheriff Neal, interposed that individual, a slight, dark man with a bristly mustache. You come out of there, hands free. For the time being, Sheriff? I expect you figure on fixing those hands so they won't be free, Well, all I've got to say is that I hope you won't spend the money foolishly, Sheriff. Rathburn leaped lightly out of the cellar. "Keep that other man down there covered, too," snapped out Neil. "It's principle more than reward money that invites me, Coyote. Hand over your gun belt and be careful how you unbuckle it." "Sheriff, it would be against my code of ethics to hand over my gun." "It can't be done, Sheriff. You'll have to come and get it." Neil hesitated. Notwithstanding the fact that he had Rathburn covered and that several other guns were covering him, then he stepped forward, never taking his eyes from Rathburn's, and secured the other's weapon. "Well, that's better, Sheriff," said Rathburn with a strange smile. "You can see how I have my pride and a little superstitions. No man has ever took a gun from me but what I've got it back. Thanks, Sheriff." Lamy had come out of the cellar. Several of the men seemed to recognize him, but kept their silence with dubious looks in their eyes. "My guide, Sheriff," said Rathburn, pointing over his shoulder at Lamy. "He was very kind. He showed me around the country. Me not being very well acquainted around here, I had to take his gun away from him and sort of encourage him along with my own, but he did very nicely." "That's just what I thought, Neil," said Brown. "This feller took after him, and he captured him and made him lead him. Isn't that so?" he asked of Lamy. "Well, now, just a minute, Judd," Rathburn interrupted with a frown. "I can't let the importance of this momentous occasion be transferred to a subordinate. You must ask your questions of me, as I am the central figure in this here affair." The cry of a girl startled them. She came running from the kitchen where she had fled when the sheriff announced his intention to shoot through the floor. "Ed," she cried, running to Lamy and throwing her arms around him. "Oh, Ed." "Who is he, ma'am?" asked the sheriff. "Your husband?" "No, he's my brother, Ed Lamy." "Well, I can recommend him if you need a guide who knows the country, Sheriff," said Rathburn genially. "I guess he had an idea of making trouble for me at first, but I had to drop on him, and he soon saw reason. I had to knock him down last night when he got fresh, but he did very well. Of course, I had an advantage on my side." He nodded toward his gun, which the official still held in his hand. "Did he make you guide him?" Neil asked Lamy, noting the empty holster. Rathburn turned so that he could look at his former captive. Lamy nodded. "Yes," he replied. I didn't know what minute I was going to get shot in the back." Rathburn's eyes glowed with an amused light. "I didn't have any idea of shooting him, Sheriff. He was too valuable as my escort on the tour. Now I wonder if that lady could spare me a cup of coffee and a biscuit." He glimpsed the boy in the kitchen doorway behind the sheriff. "Hello, Sonny," he called cheerfully. "Did you catch those freckles from your brother?" The boy gazed at him unabashed. There were actually tears in the youngster's eyes. Ed Lamy and his sister moved into the kitchen and took the boy with them. The girl had nodded to the sheriff. "She'll get you something to eat," said Neil. "What have you got on you?" He stepped to Rathburn's side. "Ah, the frisk. I see you are a regulation officer, Sheriff." Rathburn's tone fairly radiated politeness and good cheer. "The silver was rather heavy. It ain't my usual style to pack much silver, Sheriff. There's more of the bills in my hip pocket. Don't suppose there's more than 1,000 in the whole bundle." The sheriff put the bills and the silver on the table. He investigated all of Rathburn's pockets, returned him his tobacco, his papers, and his handkerchief, but kept a box of matches. Then he felt his prisoner's clothing to make sure he had no weapons concealed. He also felt his boot tops. He looked at Rathburn with a gloating expression when he had finished, and there was also a glint of admiration in the gaze he directed at him. "You know, you size right up to the descriptions of you, Coyote," he reflected in a pleasant voice. "Too bad you couldn't have been in a better business. I'm glad I caught you, but I ain't any too well. I might say any too proud of it. That may be pleasant for you to hear, but I ain't discounting your well-known ability, and I want to warn you that I or any of my men will shoot you in your tracks if you start anything that looks suspicious like." Rathburn yawned. "Sheriff, your courtesy is very greatly appreciated. I Only hope we will arrive in jail or somewhere soon where I can get some sleep. I'm all in. Chapter 11, Freedom Behind Bars. In the early afternoon, the little cavalcade rode into Dry Lake. Rathburn was nodding in his saddle, nearly asleep. "We'll keep him here tonight till I can get the facts straight," he heard Sheriff Neal say to Brown. They dismounted at a small, square stone building with bars on the windows. Then Rathburn was proudly led between a line of curious spectators inside the jail. 3 rooms comprised Dry Lake's jail. The front of the building, for a depth of a third of the distance from the front to the rear, was divided into 2 of these rooms, one, the larger, being the main office, and the other, much smaller, being the constable's private office. The balance of the building was one large room, divided into 2 old-fashioned cages with iron and steel bars. Now the doors to these 2 cages were one on either side of the door into the front office, and there was an aisle between the cages and the wall separating them from the offices. Now Rathburn was taken immediately to the cage on the left side of the office door. Sheriff Neal hesitated as he stood in the cell with him, thought for a minute, then he removed the handcuffs. "Well, that's right fine of you, Sheriff," said Rathburn sleepily, but cheerfully nevertheless. "Oh, you'll be watched well enough," said Neal as he closed the barred door behind him and locked Rathburn in. "You'll find somebody around if you try to tear the place down." "That wasn't just what I was getting at, Sheriff," said the prisoner with a glitter in his eyes. "I meant it was right fine of you to give me freedom behind the bars." Rathburn's taunting laugh rang in the official's ear as the latter pushed the men with him into the outer office. Rathburn listened, yawning, to the sheriff's giving instructions that the prisoner he watched constantly. Well, he looked about the cage, which was separated from the other cell by a wall of sheet iron. It contained nothing except a bench and a stool. He pushed the bench against the stone wall at the rear and reclined upon it, using his coat for a pillar. Then he turned his face towards the wall, shading his eyes from the light which filtered through 2 windows, high up in the wall beyond the bars, on the left side, by tipping his hat over his face. Immediately, he fell asleep. The news that the Coyote had been captured spread rapidly through the town, and many came to the jail hoping they might be able to see the prisoner. All of these were denied admittance, but Sheriff Neal told the few who had stated that they had been among the number the bandit had lined up at the point of his guns that they would be called to identify the Coyote the following day. He asked each if they were sure the bandit had 2 guns, and the reply in each case was in the affirmative. "That's funny," Neal muttered. "He only had 1 gun on him." "More than likely, the other's on his horse with his saddle," Brown pointed out. I believe he left his horse somewheres and made that feller Lamy take him to the house, thinking he could get him something to eat there, and that they wouldn't be so likely to be seen in the open on foot. You got to remember the man's more or less clever." Well, this explanation satisfied Neal, and in the minds of the men who had been in the resort when it was held up, there was no question as to the identity of the robber. Even if they had suspected otherwise, it is doubtful if they would have acknowledged it, because they considered it less of an ignominy to be held up by the notorious Coyote than by a bandit of lesser reputation. Thus did the bonds of evidence tighten about Rathburn while he slept through the late afternoon and the twilight. And when he awoke, a faint yellow light dimly illuminated his surroundings. He lay thinking for several minutes. He knew night had fallen and surmised that he had slept a full 8 hours. He could tell this because he was fully awake and alert. He turned noiselessly on his bench and saw that the light came from a lamp burning near the door to the outer office. Rathburn could hear the hum of voices, and by listening intently, ascertained that 2 men were talking, one of whom was the sheriff. He could not recognize the voice of the other speaker as a voice he had never heard before, and he could not hear what they were saying. He listened dully to the voices until he heard a horse's hooves in front of the jail. He turned back with his face to the wall and his hat tipped over his eyes as a man entered the jail office with a stamp of boots and a jingle of spurs. "Hello, constable," he heard the sheriff say. "What luck?" "Couldn't find the hoss," came a disgruntled voice. "Looked all afternoon until it got dark for him." "Confound it," exclaimed Neil. "The horse must have been around somewhere close. He surely didn't walk down the valley." "Well, that's probably right," said the other. I left a couple of your men out there to keep up a searching when daylight comes. Now that feller Lamy showed us about where they left the horses, his hoss and the coyotes, but they wasn't there. He said there was a bunch of wild hosses in the valley and that they probably got away and gone with them. We saw the wild hosses, but, well, we couldn't get anywhere near them. Couldn't get near enough to see if any of them was wearing saddles or not. We had some chase while it lasted. I'll recite. "Did Lamy say how they came to leave their horses?" asked the sheriff in an annoyed tone. "Well, it was the coyotes' orders. Thought they'd be safer in the middle of the posse or something like that. Made Lamy leave the hosses and run for the house and made him get down in the cellar with him. Don't know if he knew Lamy lived there or not, but reckon it wouldn't have made any difference." The sheriff was pacing the floor of his office as the footfalls attested. "I've ordered that Lamy in tomorrow. I've a lot more questions to ask him." "Well, you might as well get a few winks, constable. Brown and the rest of 'em have hit the hay. Even the prisoner's tired out, and that's saying something for as tough a bird as he is, but I wish I had his horse. I've got to have his horse." Rathburn was smiling at the wall. He heard Neil walk to the door and look in. Receding footsteps told him the constable was leaving, and for a time there was silence in the outer office. Rathburn sat up quietly and began easing off his right boot. The boot came slowly, very slowly, as Rathburn worked at it, careful not to make any noises. Then, just as it came free, the sheriff again strode to the door and looked in. He saw Rathburn yawning as the boot dropped on the floor. Rathburn looked at the sheriff sleepily as the official strode into the aisle and peered in between the bars. He tipped the bootless foot back on its toes as he lifted his other foot and tugged at the boot. "That you, Sheriff?" he asked with another yawn. "The lights are so bad I can't see good. Guess I'm a little groggy anyway. I was too dang tired when I went to sleep to take off my boots." "Well, you've got another 10 hours to sleep," said Neil with a scowl, "and you'll have plenty of time to get rid of your saddle soreness. You're going to ride in automobiles and trains for a while, and keeping out of the hot sun and the wet." The sheriff laughed harshly at his own words. Rathburn let the other boot drop. I expect I'll get something to eat now and then, too." "Feel hungry?" asked Neil. "I might chaw on a biscuit before I take another nap," yawned the prisoner. "Well, I'll see if I can scare you up a bite," said the sheriff, leaving. Rathburn heard him say something to someone in front. Then the sheriff went out of the building. The other man came in and looked at Rathburn curiously. He was of medium build, with white hair and a face seamed and lined in red. Rathburn instantly recognized in his jailer a man of the desert, possibly of the border country. "So you're the Coyote," said the jailer in a rather high-pitched voice. Rathburn winked at him. "Well, that's what they say," he replied. "You size up to him all right," observed the man of the desert. "And I can tell quick enough when I get a good look at you and inspect your left forearm. I've had your descriptions in front of my eyes on paper and from a half a dozen persons that knowed you for 3 years. "You been trailing me?" asked Rathburn curiously. "I have, and it ain't no credit to this bunch here that they got you. For I was headed in this direction myself and arrived most as soon as you did." "You from Arizona?" asked Rathburn, grasping his right foot in his left hand. "I'm from Arizona and Mexico and a few other places," was the answer. I've helped catch men like you before, Coyote. Rathburn frowned, still keeping his hand over his right foot. I don't like that word, Coyote, he said softly, holding the other's gaze between the bars. A coyote is a cowardly breed of animal, isn't it? And a tricky one, said the jailer. I ain't saying you're a coward, but you're tricky, and that's bad enough. Maybe so, agreed Rathburn. And here's our friend, his nibs, the sheriff. He went out to rustle me some grub. He wants to keep me fat for hanging. His laugh rang through the jail, empty save for himself and the two officers. But the temporary jailer hesitated, looking at Rathburn's eyes before he turned to the sheriff. Open that door and I'll take it in to him, ordered the sheriff. I can't get this stuff through the bars. You might keep him covered. The jailer's hand flew to his hip for his gun as he also brought up a large key on a ring. He unlocked the door to the cage. He held it open while he kept his gun trained upon Rathburn. The sheriff entered and placed the food on the stool and a large bowl of coffee on the floor beside it. Then he backed out, watching Rathburn keenly as the latter sat on the bench with his right foot in his hand. When the door clanged shut and the key rattled in the lock, Rathburn let down his right foot, took 2 steps, and pulled the stool up to the bench. He stepped back and secured the coffee. Then he began to eat and drink, keeping his right foot tipped on its toes while the other 2 officials watched him attentively. Sheriff, said Rathburn suddenly, between bites on a huge meat sandwich, could you let me have a stub of a lead pencil and a sheet of paper to write a letter on? Easy enough, answered Neil. Of course, you know all mail that goes out of the jail is read by us before it's delivered, if it's delivered at all. I'll chance it, snapped out Rathburn. As the sheriff left to get the writing materials with the jailer following him, doubtless for a whispered confab as to what Rathburn might be wanting to write, and its possible bearing on his capture, the prisoner hastily ran his left hand down into his right sock and with some difficulty withdrew a peculiar-shaped leather case, about 10 inches long and nearly the width of his foot. This he put within his shirt. Now, when the officials returned, he had finished his repast and was waiting for them near the bars with a smile of gratitude on his lips. This may be a confession I'm going to write, he said, grinning at Neil. It's going to take me a long time, I reckon, but you said I had something like 10 hours for sleep, so I guess I can spare 2 or 3 for this effort at literary composition. I figure, Sheriff, that this'll be my masterpiece. His look puzzled the sheriff as he took the pencil and paper through the bars, returned to his bunk. He drew up the stool and sat upon it. It was a little lower than the bench, so putting his paper on the bench, he had a fairly good makeshift desk. He began to write steadily, and after a few minutes the sheriff and the jailer retired back into the office. It didn't take Rathburn a quarter of an hour to write what he wished on the first of the several pieces of paper. He tore off what he had written, doubled it again and again into a small square, took out his sack of tobacco, which he had been allowed to retain, and put it therein with the loose tobacco. Then he wrote for a few minutes on the second sheet of paper. When the sheriff looked in later, he evidently was slowly and laboriously achieving a composition. Rathburn heard the sheriff go out of the front door a few minutes later. Instantly, he was alert. He drew on his boots. He surmised that the sheriff had gone out for something to eat, and though he wasn't sure of this, it was true. "Oh, jailer," he called amiably. The wrinkled face of the desert trailer appeared in the office doorway. Rathburn looked about from his seat on the stool. "This job ain't none too easy as it is," he complained. "I was a writer. I'm a first-rate cowhand. Let me take your knife to sharpen this pencil with." And when I asked the sheriff for a stub of pencil, he took me at my word. "Sure, I'll let you have my knife," said the jailer sarcastically. "How about my gun? You want that too?" "Ah, come on, old-timer," pleaded Rathburn. The lead in this pencil's worn clean down into the wood. Well, you hand it over here and I'll sharpen it, said the jailer, drawing his pocket knife. Rathburn walked to the bars and held out the pencil. An amiable smile played on his lips. Well, you'll have to excuse me, he said contritely. I forgot it wasn't jail etiquette to ask for a knife. But I ain't had much experience in jail. Now, according to his nibs, the sheriff, I'm in to get pretty well acquainted with him, eh? He watched the jailer as he began sharpening the pencil. Speaking of knives now, he continued in a confiding tone, I got in a ruckus near down the border, and some gents started after me. Well, one of 'em got pretty close enough to take some skin off my shoulder with a bullet. He just sort of compelled me to shoot back. I suppose you killed him? Observed the jailer, pausing in his work of sharpening the pencil. I ain't saying, replied Rathburn. Anyways, I had a hole up down there for a few days, and as luck would have it, I had to put up with a Mexican. All that Mex would do was argue that a knife was better than a gun. He claimed it was sure and made no noise. Now those were the hardest talking points, and I'll be danged if there isn't something in it. But what I was getting at is that I didn't have nothing to do, and that Mexican got me to practice knife throwing. Now you know how slick those fellows are at throwing a blade. Well, in a couple of weeks that I hung around there, he coached me along pretty good till I could throw a knife just as well as he could. Now he thought it was a great sport teaching me to throw a knife so good that-a-way. Since I left down there, I've sort of practiced that knife-throwing business now and then, just for fun. Anyways, I thought it was just for fun, but now I see, jailer, that it was my luck protecting me. Anything you learn is liable to prove handy sometime. Don't move an inch or I'll let you have it. Rathburn's hand snapped out of his shirt and up above his right shoulder. The man from the desert shuddered involuntarily as he saw the yellow light from the lamp play fitfully upon a keen, white blade. Well, now, our man the Coyote's working on getting out of this lockup, and he'll be free again, or at least on the run. We'll see, and we'll see next time I talk to you. So you come on back around and enjoy this campfire with us, and enjoy the people around it. We'll tell stories. Well, until that time comes, be good to people, and I'll talk to you then. This is Clay Steele. Hey folks, Clay Steele here. You know, I spend a lot of time outdoors around this here campfire. If you're like me, you get downright annoyed by all those pesky mosquitoes buzzing around. They're just looking for a free meal. Nothing ruins a good night under the stars faster than slapping and scratching at bites. And that's why I keep the bee-itch stop. I keep it handy. One swipe and that itch is gone. No more burning, no more scratching, just good old relief. Made right here in Nevada with all natural ingredients. It's safe for the whole family. So if you're tired of being a mosquito buffet, do yourself a favor and get you some bee-itch stop today. And this is Clay Steele. Watch out for them bugs.